Consensus Network.
Hello everybody, my name is Daniel Prince and I am the host of the Once BITten podcast. This is a podcast focused on Bitcoin. It's my mission to interview as many people as I can around the different aspects of Bitcoin and help people understand exactly what Bitcoin could mean for them and for their families and for their future. I hope you enjoy the show. Thank you so much for listening. Hey guys, welcome to this edition of the Once BITten podcast. Joining me on today's show is Dave Bradley, otherwise known as @BitcoinBrains on Twitter. Dave is founder of Bitcoin Brains, which is one of the world's first physical Bitcoin stores. He founded that in 2013, and he's the co-founder of Bull Bitcoin, a very well-known Canadian Bitcoin service, Bitcoin-only service, very much an OG in the space, and very much into building Bitcoin businesses and supporting those people that are looking to build Bitcoin businesses and helping entrepreneurs. So I hope you enjoy this show and reach out to Dave if there's any way that you feel that you can add value to his pursuits once you've listened to the interview. And talking about supporting Bitcoin-only businesses, Dave will tell you it's so important that new people coming into the space are guided to the right companies. I know there are people out there that get bored of listening to the shills on not just my podcast, but others as well. But if we didn't use our platforms to spread the word of the Bitcoin companies out there that are able to help the noobs, then they would never be able to find them, they would never be able to grow, and we would never be able to move forward as a community. So, if you want to skip forward, feel free. If you want to hang around and hear about the Bitcoin-only companies that can help you or your loved ones or your friends, family, then stick around for a quick shill. Because Swan Bitcoin have got you covered in the US of A. swanbitcoin.com/BITten. You can stack with them, you can set up your auto buys, and you can also get financial advice directly from the team of Chads over at Swan. You can do the same in Europe with Relay, relai.ch. They have a white glove service, but you can just download the app and start buying up to 1,000 Swiss equivalent per day without any KYC. So just get straight onto it. Hit the link in the show notes and you'll save on commissions there. Coin Corner are based out of the Isle of Man. They can accept your sterling and your euros, your dirty fiat, in exchange for Bitcoin, and you can set up auto buys with those guys as well as merchant accounts. Hodl have a global peer-to-peer trading platform. No KYC necessary. What does that mean? Know your customer. So you don't have to send in any of your passports or silly pictures of yourself holding today's newspaper. Hodl also have a lending platform where you can do peer-to-peer lending, and they've got Debify coming out hopefully in the next couple of months, which will be a much more kind of a much better user experience coming to the lending market. So look out for that one when Max announces that again. WasabiWallet.io have you covered if you want to start a CoinJoin journey. They make it very easy. You just open your laptop, download WasabiWallet.io, create a wallet, run some sats through it, pull them off the exchanges and the apps, and watch the magic happen in front of your eyes. Then cold storage is the final step. Bitbox have you covered with the Bitbox 02. It's a Bitcoin-only hardware device, Bitcoin signing device, and you can get one by hitting the link bitbox.swiss/BITten and use the code BITTEN at checkout to get 5% off. Now, mempool.space, have you gone and had a look at the Bitcoin blockchain? Have you shown anybody the Bitcoin blockchain? I use it all the time to show people what it looks like, what's going on under the hood, and it's an amazing tool to help you orange pill different people, and it's an excellent educational resource as well. Get out and meet your plebs. I can't stress this enough. Join Orange Pill app. Give it a whirl. It's like $3 to join, and you pay that monthly, or you buy the GigaChad membership if you're happy with it. It's growing all the time. More and more plebs are joining the app, and you can find them, who's near you, who's in the town, villages, or cities that you're going to visit, or beach resorts, or whatever it is that you're going to do. Find your plebs, Go meet them. Get to a conference. We have the Baltic Honey Badger coming up in September. You can use the code BITten to get a discount there, 10% off. That is put on by Hodl Hodl. And you also have in October Liberty in a Lifetime, which is Free Private Cities. No, they changed to Free Cities Foundation. And they're putting on parallel structures. So it's great the fact that we've found freedom money, but how can we use that freedom money? Where can we use that freedom money? Who are the other people out there building parallel structures? And where might we be drawn to either live or spend more time and make further bridges to take more control and self-sovereignty over ourselves, our families, and our lives. So that's put on by Free Cities Foundation. It's going to be in Prague in mid-October. Get a book from Consensus Network. Big shout out to the guys over there. Enjoy this rip with Dave. We are recording and the pressure is on Lauren. And now Dave is trembling in his boots because he has no idea what she's about to ask him. And as Odell would say, you are facing the toughest interviewer in the space. So brace yourself. Welcome to the Once Bitten podcast. Thank you for taking the time to come on.
Thank you for having me. I'm ready.
All right, Lauren, fire away.
Yeah, you make a lot of Bitcoin companies, and my question is, why do you make so many Bitcoin companies?
Well, that's a good question. I probably would have been better off if I didn't make any Bitcoin companies. I have all these things from my past where we opened a store in 2013 and I think I cashed in like 120 Bitcoins for the furniture for the store. And, I no longer have any of that furniture except for like a broken desk drawer. And so, yeah, I mean, like, I guess I make Bitcoin companies because I like to build things. I've been an entrepreneur pretty much my whole life, and I've always been like hustling with something. And for the last like 13 years, that hustle has been Bitcoin. I've been like buying and selling Bitcoin one way or the other, essentially. And that's most of what all the companies that I've been involved with do, essentially.
All right. Should we get a rundown of those companies, Lauren, so we know what we're dealing with here?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Fire away.
Yeah. So I got started in Bitcoin in 2010. I didn't have a company at that point. I was just like mining it in my basement, selling it to people on local Bitcoins. I decided at some point that I needed to make that a real business because I was meeting people at coffee shops and they probably thought I was a drug dealer. And so we opened up, it might have been the first like brick and mortar store in the world that actually was like a full Bitcoin store. Like we sold Bitcoin mining equipment. We had like a little bit of merchandise early on. This is before hardware wallets even existed. So we started selling those once they came out. And we opened that in Calgary in 2013. And we're very lucky to hit right before that 2013 bull market that ended with the Mt. Gox collapse, as well as China banning Bitcoin for the first time. And we sold that store a couple of years later. We kept the business. That business was called Bitcoin Brains. That's still what my handles are and everything online. My personal brand website, which is very important, is bitcoinbrains.com. And I ran that for a couple of years, and then eventually we merged that company into with another company in Quebec called Satoshi Portal with Francis Pouliot to create Bull Bitcoin. And so I was one of the founders of Bull Bitcoin there at the start, and I was there for about 2 years, at which point I left to create a company that would make software for Bitcoin ATMs, because I had a lot of people looking for that and had some idea that there was some demand. And then at that point, I reached out to Adam O'Brien, who was running a company called Bitcoin Solutions, as a potential client. And he was like, I want to do that too. He was running a Bitcoin ATM company. And so we ended up partnering up on the software company. And then because of that partnership, I kind of got sucked into his company, which is now called Bitcoin Well. That's where I'm at currently. So I've been there for 3 years, at which point we've grown it pretty significantly in terms of the number of ATMs and revenue. And we've got offices in multiple cities where we sell Bitcoin. And we were also the first non-custodial Bitcoin company in the world to go public. So that was a big milestone for us. lots of annoying time and legal expenses to do that, but we're publicly traded on the Canadian Stock Exchange, the TSX Venture, as BTCW.V. And that's been a pretty crazy journey. Not really worth it though so far. We missed the end of the last bull run. So the hope is when you take a company public that, you get some crazy valuations when the market runs, when we get a bull run, all the Bitcoin stocks run even more. So that's where we're at. We're a non-custodial business focused on ATMs, in-person services, and our online product where we sell Bitcoins. And it's all completely non-custodial. Right now we're just in Canada, but we're like days away from having a working product to expand to the US. So hopefully by the time this airs, we will be live in the US with at least our like online and brokerage services.
There's a lot for me to ask questions about. So maybe you want to say goodnight.
Thank you so much. And I think there was like 4 companies, 5. I couldn't count.
Yeah.
Yeah, something like that. And then I've advised a whole bunch of companies and worked with some other startups to help them raise money. And then I've kind of gotten into the event space as well. So like we're putting on an event in Calgary July 4th and 5th called the Bitcoin Rodeo, like a Bitcoin only conference. Going to be fairly small, like maybe 400 people, and just really highly curated content, very focused on the message of what Bitcoin is and why it's important to the world. It's not going to be a super technical conference or super, we're not going to get really down the rabbit holes on Austrian economics or, different technical areas of Bitcoin. It's going to be aimed at creating content that can be useful for anyone from like a beginner to an expert. Because that's one thing that I noticed. I go to a lot of conferences. I never watch the content. I feel like it's the same people that I've just seen on Twitter having the same conversations that I've already seen or engaged with if I wanted to. And I think that a lot of the conferences out there, the content sort of aims at like the very engaged, sort of medium level casual users, I guess, who don't necessarily like, I've been up to my neck in Bitcoin for like 13 years at this point. So, I think there's a broader group that they aim that content at, but then they also miss, the beginners. And so I think a lot of people would be very, sort of overwhelmed and out of their depth listening to Michael Saylor talk to Robert Breedlove about hard money. It's not like the easiest spot to jump in at. And so we're kind of taking an approach to making the content, more about, how Bitcoin interacts with the world.
Yeah.
So
it's funny that I mentioned that to you before we hit record. What's been going across my mind as well. So we're clearly on the same page there, because you go to these conferences and like you, I spend as much time as I can with the plebs and very little time sitting down actually watching the panels. And I feel guilty doing that because, the people are flying in from a long way to share their experience, whatever else. But because I host a podcast, I have those conversations anyway, like at least 5 times a week. So for me to be there and be just surrounded by in real life situations, physical contact with the plebs, with listeners, with new people as well, it is so uplifting. But like I said, we forget how new noobs are and how thirsty for that information that they are, and how can we curate the educational content for them, because following my rabbit hole journey is going to be different to somebody that's falling into it now in 2023. It's not like, oh yeah, go and read Andreas Antonopoulos. No, huh? Like, who's that dude? Oh yeah, well he shills Ethereum as well and stuff now. So just it's different. It is different times, different content, different people, different messaging. And yeah, it's very important to figure out the best way to communicate that message to people that are, just being pulled in. But
Yeah.
Before we get deeper into that, let's say goodnight to Lauren.
Yep. Anyways, thank you so much. Bye.
Bye. Good night.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I think that's pretty interesting. That's kind of the direction we're taking with some of this content at this conference. So we're starting the first day with a session that's completely free, and it's going to have it's going to be about an hour and a half. It's going to have the first segment that is basically like why Bitcoin, and we're trying to essentially sell Bitcoin as hard as we can. We're right in the heart of downtown Calgary, which is really like an oil city. There's about 600 oil companies with headquarters within 10 blocks of the conference location. So we're hoping to get a lot of oil and gas people in there for this free session, hit them with the really concise description of like, what is Bitcoin? Why is it important? Why might it be important to you or your life or your company? And then the second half of that hour and a half is going to be Ben Perrin, BTC Sessions, who's he's my sort of like co-host of this conference that us and a couple other friends are putting this thing on. And he's going to be going with the how of all those things, right? So that's part of where I start in a lot of ways, is pointing people. Once somebody has told me that they want to get into Bitcoin, that's usually where I send them. It's like, go check out BTC Sessions. He's got all these videos about like, how do you set things up? How do you store your coins? How do you keep things safe? But it's all presented from the lens of Bitcoin only. So there's not like, you're not going to get trapped by your choices and led down a path where, the confidence scams. I don't know how many people have gotten into, I'm trying to get rid of the term shit coins. I'm calling them casino coins now.
Right.
I don't know how many people have gotten into casino coins simply because they saw them in the ledger or the Trezor software or something like that. And now it seems like, it's there with the, the Bitcoin guy recommended this wallet. And now I see these other things in the wallet. So they must be legitimate, right? And I really like that about Ben's content. There's no side tracks that take you away from the core message of what Bitcoin is and why it's important. So we're putting a lot of that energy into the conference. One part that I'm really excited for is we've got a Bitcoin elevator pitch. So like, I think I got mine down pretty well after many years, but that's like a pretty hard thing to do as well, is when you...
What is that? Just slamming the person against the side of the elevator?
That might be a good way to do it. But basically, like, if you're like trapped with a stranger for 45 seconds and your goal is to sell them on the idea of Bitcoin, like, what are you going to say? And I think that's kind of a cool angle, because we all do that all the time, whether like sometimes you want to, sometimes you don't. Sometimes it's like you're at your cousin's barbecue and then some guy is just like a know-it-all who has to talk about Bitcoin. And so you have to talk about it. And sometimes people are really gung-ho to hear about it. And you got to have a good answer. You got to have a tight 45 seconds to talk to people about that stuff. And so we've got like a bunch of the different speakers and stuff that we're bringing in. We're all going to be competing at see who's got the best short pitch sheet, see what we can steal from each other.
It sounds awesome. How can people get there, and what can people do to help you guys out?
Yeah, I mean, it's the Bitcoin Rodeo on Twitter, and bitcoinrodeo.com is the website where you can get some tickets and whatnot. It's July 4th and 5th in Calgary, and it's right before the Calgary Stampede, which is like a massive, it's the largest outdoor show on earth. It's a massive, like rodeo fair, giant event that takes over the whole city. We get about 2 million people coming to town for this very large event. So it's right before that. So if anybody wants to come to Calgary, this is the time to come. You can get the Bitcoin scene of Western Canada, which I think is fairly strong and kind of unique, because we've got a really strong, like individualistic mindset in this part of the country. We're the Texas of Canada.
Right.
But we're I think if anything, more freedom minded than Texas in most areas.
So how did that settle? So we had the way the US West Coast was settled were people, go west, young man. And then you hit the whatever trail that you get over the mountains in the Midwest and whatever else. And, you find yourself in Oregon or Texas or wherever. The really brave fuckers, they went north.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of, the settlement, I actually took 2.5 years of a history degree before I dropped out of university many years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So my knowledge is, I've learned a lot about this. My knowledge is rusty, but, yeah, I mean, the colonization was pretty similar of Canada and the US. The thing that really drove people going west was when we built our railroad.
Mm.
We had a lot less sort of colonialism the way that the American West had, where you could just like stake a claim and have a bunch of land. The vast majority, like I think it's like 94% of Canada, of the land of Canada is owned by the Crown. So really very little is owned by private individuals. And so we're a little bit different in that sense, in that we're the section of the British colony that didn't revolt.
Mm-hmm.
That's why Canada is in many ways like a nation of rule followers, and we're known for being very polite and saying sorry and all this stuff. And I think it kind of selected, like everybody who wanted to dump the tea in the bay and kill the British were in the South. And then the people who just wanted to mind their own business and carry on with life came up north, where there was none of that going on. So that, I think, is a major problem for Canada as a country, and has led us to what I think is a very bad spot nationally. But here in Western Canada, it's very different. We've always had a much more individualistic and freedom-minded mindset. That's why I think there's, we're one of the top Bitcoin adoption areas in the world. I think here in Western Canada, we've got a massive scene of, I think several hundred at this point, small companies mining Bitcoin at oil and gas sites, capturing gas that would have otherwise been vented or flared, and just eking out the margins on that business. And I think that's really in line with who we are as a people, and that's why I'm really glad to see, like, we just had an election yesterday. Our Premier Danielle Smith was reelected, and she's a Bitcoiner. She's a rational person and very much in favor of personal freedoms. And I like to think that Alberta in particular, and some other portions of Western Canada, are moving in an opposite direction of the rest of Canada, where they're moving more towards a collectivist future with central bank digital currencies and health mandates controlling every aspect of our lives, and really just an ever increasing scope of government control that really limits and destroys personal freedoms. Whereas out here, we're trying to go in the opposite direction. We're trying to go more towards a rational, objectivist, capitalist society that values personal freedom, personal income, personal creation of value, and all of those, I think are values that align really closely with Bitcoiners. And so, you see a lot of Bitcoiners around the world moving to, El Salvador, Costa Rica, wherever the hot place for, even Puerto Rico, the cool beach place that's coming up. But I think Alberta is becoming quietly a place where Bitcoiners are moving. And I've had I talk a lot of shit about how good our beef is and our mountains and our air and how great it is here. And I've had more people than I expected who've like messaged me being like, yeah, I'm going to move from Scotland, and give me some advice and stuff like that. So I think Alberta is one of the most promising places in the world for Bitcoiners and Bitcoin companies. And I'm glad, like, I stuck it out through the ridiculous COVID scenario that we had. And, a lot of people wanted to flee, but I'm not going anywhere. This is my place, and they can't have it.
So, let's keep shilling Alberta. Why not?
Yeah.
You brought up Danielle Smith. from my side of the pond, I don't know who she is or what she's done. I don't even know really how your country is set up, whether it's like the States or whether it's more like the UK. Can you give us like the political landscape in a nutshell? And can she fight back against Trudeau, or are you still under? Yeah.
Yeah.
For it.
Yeah. So Danielle Smith, she was a radio host. Actually, she was in politics years ago, left politics and went on to become a radio host. She was very successful as a radio host, kind of like conservative, right-wing, angled talk show. A bunch of us Bitcoiners, myself, Ben Perrin, BTC Sessions, Francis Pouliot, and a few others, have been on her show over the years talking to her about Bitcoin. So she knows Bitcoin. She is a Bitcoiner. She had Bitcoins in Quadriga, which was one of our multiple Bitcoin exchanges that disappeared in Canada. We had a guy who allegedly went to India and died. I think it's something like $500 million went missing. And it was revealed that, not only did he die with the keys and some of the Bitcoins were lost that way, but he had lost or stolen a bunch of the Bitcoins previous to his death and was operating a fractional reserve for a long time. So there's like a big scandal here. We warned her to take the coins out of there. She didn't do it. So she lost her Bitcoins, which is kind of an interesting lesson for somebody in a position like that now to have learned, because it puts her in a position to really understand why it's important for users to learn to self-custody their coins and what the difference between those two things is. And not even just self-custody, but like, in that case, she was trusting Quadriga to hold her coins. And there was no methodology of why she had decided to trust them. And from somebody like me, who was very integrated into the industry already at that point, I already knew not to trust them. And I was telling her not to trust them, but there was no real way for her to make that decision. So I think it's kind of an interesting spot where like, we all spend a lot of time talking about self-custody, in the industry, those of us who are like hardcore maximalists and really care a lot about what's going on. But then at the same time, most of the biggest companies in the world that sell Bitcoin are custodying coins. And, you can look at something like Swan Bitcoin, where like their mission is very similar to a bunch of the companies that I've created or been involved with, except for that custody side. And they've decided to do that basically just because it's easy. And it makes the workflow from like, I want to buy Bitcoin to I now have Bitcoin as simple as possible. And that's something that we struggle with. Like that's our biggest, on our non-custodial online platform, that's the biggest spot where we lose customers, is when they realize they have to make their own wallet. And so we're starting to explore some areas where like, in my opinion, it's a very bad idea for the company that you buy your Bitcoins from to also be the company that holds your Bitcoins. Because those are two different businesses, and the risk created by one can leach into the other. So I think if you're going to hold your Bitcoins with anyone, it should be a company that just does that. And it's also one of those scenarios where when you see an exchange and they're willing to allow you to hold your coins with them for free, it's because it's one of a couple things. One is that they're not actually offering any protection. They're offering a small measure of convenience, and buyer beware, your coins are at risk. In that case, there's not really any negative externalities for the exchange to hold those, other than like a potential catastrophic relationship hit if they lose all the coins. But really, it's kind of like what they always say about social media, where it's like, if you're not paying for it, you're the product, right? And so you kind of have to wonder, if somebody wants to hold your coins and they're not going to charge you to do that, why do they want them? Mm-hmm. And the answer is either that the cost for them to hold them is very small because they're not putting a lot of work or money into the processes and security to hold those things. Or, in a lot of cases, like we've seen with this whole lending meltdown, they're willing to hold your coins because they have some way to make money on the coins while they're holding them. And there is no way to make money by holding Bitcoins without taking a risk on those Bitcoins. And that's just that's just an insurmountable truth. And they, the custodians of the world have been taking those risks. And like we've seen with FTX, when they take the risk and win, they keep the profits. And when they take the risk and lose, they just say, sorry, we lost the coins, basically. So I think there's room in the world for like a middle level model somewhere in there where like, a new person who wants to get onboarded into the space can be presented with a custodian that is just a custodian that charges a fee to hold Bitcoins. And, you can make that user experience super smooth and user friendly, but still communicate the fact that like, hey, you're holding your coins with this other person. They are at risk based on the choices that other person makes. And they're charging you the following for this service. This is the easiest way to get started, but we recommend that you move on from this as soon as you can. Essentially.
It's really tough with this DCA model as well, which I'm sure you'll agree is a very good model to push to newbies. Because taking self-custody of $10 worth of Bitcoin every week is also not the best practice.
Yeah.
So there is something to be done here. There is a gap in the market.
Yeah, there's a gap there too that you're describing as well, where like that $10 weekly DCA, that can't be on chain in the long term, right? It's just not going to work. If every single person wants to put their weekly DCA all on chain, there's not enough space, and that the economic value of those transactions is too low. Without ordinals or any of this other garbage, it's still not going to work. And so we need different solutions, and those need to be layers on top of Bitcoin. It might be Lightning Network, it might be Arc or something else that we haven't thought of yet. But it also might be either federated or centralized solutions. So something like Liquid, which is federated, or even centralized solutions at that kind of scale that we're talking about are not that big of a risk. You know what I mean? Like if you've got your weekly DCA going and you've got $10 going in there, and then the company settles to you once a month, you've somewhat unnecessarily risked $30 in order to save those on-chain fees. But I don't think that really matters. And I think that there is in the Bitcoin space a very sort of religious fervor towards decentralization. And it's not always necessary, right? We don't need the world's largest supercomputer to secure your coffee purchases. It's not important. And the actual risk at the end of the day, for me as a user, if I'm using Visa or the Lightning Network, like the risk of using Visa is not high. I'm not significantly compromising my average purchasing power. There's all these sort of like outlier use cases where you need censorship resistance, even on small transactions and stuff like that. The trucker convoys that we had in Canada was a good example of that. But for the most part, like if Visa was just operating the same way that it does now, but in Bitcoin, denominated in Bitcoin, and then settling to the main chain every hour or every day or whatever it was, for most users, that would be really adequate for most of those small level transactions. And so I think like there's a lot of stuff that sort of has to shake out in the market in terms of like how important is it to the average user that their small scale transactions actually be decentralized in the long term. And like, I don't know where that's going to go. The only way that those kinds of small scale transactions, a solution like Lightning Network, the only way that something like that can win as the way that we do our coffee transactions is if it's able to eliminate enough of the sort of bad user experience pieces that would allow it to compete meaningfully with something like Visa running Bitcoin. Mm-hmm. And it's possible that it won't. It's possible that the limits of the Lightning Network are too severe to allow it to get to that point really ever. And it's it's an open question. It would be better if we can eliminate all those problems and solve that, and everything does become a lot more trustless. But I don't think that's very important to the core mission of Bitcoin, which I think has really very little to do with payments.
All right. Do I go there first, or do I pivot? No, let's explore this, and I'll come back to that bombshell. Because many of us are out there trying to orange pill our favorite restaurants, bars, cafes, whoever else, because we want to build that economy and civilization in the town and the community in which we live. Right now, I've been working on the guy that runs the restaurant that we really love going to, and we go in there for a Bitcoin lunch with another couple just Thursday. And about the best I can have him do, because you figure out the kind of personality you're talking to as well, right? It's like, all right, yeah. So what you need to do is you need to get on Amazon, get a Raspberry, and then I'll come in and I'll help you and we'll spend 6 hours building it. It's like, no, download Moon Wallet, and then we're going to send you like 300 euros worth of Bitcoin between us, and this is how you do it. That is not a perfect solution, because the amount of times that hasn't worked, or internet's down, or this, that, and the other thing, wallet of Satoshi, these are custodial solutions as well. It's not his actual Bitcoin. It's a touch point, which is very, very important. But, and to your point, you were making, that there is a gap in the market here, and I just listened to that episode with Stefan Livera, with the ARC guy. What's his name on Twitter? BTCQ or something. I can't remember exactly. Sorry if you're listening. Fascinating conversation. And it gives me so much hope for the future of where this is going, because people see the problem. They're trying, as Bitcoiners do, to solve the problem. And as Bitcoiners do, are trying to build a business around that problem. And that's what you have done since 2010. So what is your advice, actionable key points for people that are listening to shows like this or anybody else, where they listen to that show and they think, I can solve that, but I'm trapped in my fiat job. How do I make the transition? How do I move into building a Bitcoin business?
Yeah. So, first of all, I would not recommend it. You'd probably,
Thanks for listening to the Once Bitten show, everybody.
Yeah.
This was Dave Bradley.
I mean, I would have way more wealth if I had kept working fiat jobs and just stacked Bitcoin as hard as I could the whole time. I'd have way less knowledge about Bitcoin and have way less personal capital. In terms of my own skill set and my own brain, I'd know a lot fewer important things, I think, if I hadn't gotten into the Bitcoin space as deep as I have. But yeah, I would have been way better off to just go and get a fiat job and stack. So you got to weigh that. Like, some people do make more money by going into Bitcoin, but a lot of people make less money overall. That said, it is an exciting industry where there's lots of money to be made, but you have to compare those gains, whatever you can make against like just buying Bitcoins and holding them, which is a thing that can be hard to beat in terms of returns. Right. And so, that said, my experience with that stuff. So we had the store, like I said, and I think this is like 2014, 2015. We had this deal with another Canadian Bitcoin exchange that had just gotten defunct, that has now gone defunct. And we were basically offering merchant services to retail location. And we had this little mobile app that you could use that would generate a Bitcoin price, pull up a QR code, validate the payment, and then it would automatically convert the funds back to Canadian dollars if they wanted to, or they could hold whatever percentage they want in Bitcoin. And it was kind of janky. We were way too early. We got about 60 companies in Calgary here accepting Bitcoins. And we had our office in the back of a coffee shop. And that coffee shop got lots of Bitcoin transactions. But of the remaining merchants, literally 0 transactions other than me. Like nobody spent any Bitcoins at any of those other merchants. And we were way too early. I think there's a bit more of a niche for that merchant services right now, but there's still a huge gap. Like when you're talking about the 2 options that you're describing with this guy, where you can like, if he's super technical and wants to learn everything himself and set up his own BTC Pay server or whatever it is, like that guy can take payment however he wants. He can figure out whatever it needs to be. And he probably will, because that's interesting, right? That next step, somebody who's not nearly as technical, but is interested in Bitcoin, usually for reasons that have more to do with the economics than the technicals of Bitcoin. They see it as a hedge. They see it as like digital gold they can have under their mattress, money that nobody will know they have. All these different reasons why people might want to get into Bitcoin and might want to start accepting it their business. And they just want a kind of smooth solution. And so things like what you're describing with setting up a wallet, or, there's a whole bunch of different merchant services software out now that you can set up. And it all works okay. It works pretty well. It works a lot better than what we had, 8 years ago, but it's still not really fully integrated with all of the other systems that they use. So one of the tricky parts is like, most businesses have like an inventory system, a point of sale system, and a payment system that all sort of tie in together. And I haven't seen any like really high quality Bitcoin payment processing software that ties in directly to the existing point of sale software, merchant service software, and all this stuff. And I know there's a bunch of people working on it in different ways. I think that's sort of where it has to get to be meaningfully competitive at scale, is for both the merchant who wants to accept Bitcoin and the user who wants to pay with it. It needs to meaningfully compete with Visa. And like I was mentioning, like all the payment technologies of like Apple Pay, Google Pay, and tap your phone, whatever it is, it needs to be like at least as good as that to compete at scale, because most people don't really care. Like they just want things to be smooth. They want their customers' payments to go through. And, there's a whole bunch of people around the world working on getting their local places to accept Bitcoin, but no one's ever going to get past like a small niche of curious people who are sold on the Bitcoin idea until the software is there to compete meaningfully with existing traditional finance payment services. And that I think is just not going to change. Like we need to get to at least that point. Our Lightning Network, wallets, services, merchant processing, it all just needs to be much better than it is, or the like 80-90% of the normie merchants are not going to care. They're not going to use it. And even if you can convince them, the normie users are not going to, because people just don't want to, there's no incentive as a payment tool for either of those people to use it if it's worse.
I'm completely convinced somebody's going to solve this, because I believe in the community, and as I'm sure as you do. Look where Lightning is now compared to where it was 4 years ago. It's incredible.
Yeah, it's gotten a lot better, but it's still like, it's just a lot worse than using Apple Pay. And it's far enough away that it's like competing with a 10 or 15-year-old system. It's not remotely competitive from a user experience standpoint. And unless you are ideologically committed to the idea of Bitcoin, there's no way anyone would consider using it. It's just worse.
Another bombshell. So to go back to the last bombshell, you said, and I won't quote you, I think you said something on the lines of that Bitcoin is not just a payments network.
Yeah, and I think payments are very important, and Bitcoin does a very good job of payments in its niche, right? It's able to make payments of any value anywhere in the world in a permissionless way, and that's extremely important, that permissionless side. You can't undersell the need for censorship resistance across the world. But the fact is that even though there are a lot of very important things that really, really need censorship resistance, most things don't. And for that reason, like nobody at scale is going to be willing to pay the overhead to make something censorship resistant to make sure that their copy purchase remains censorship resistant. And I think that's kind of the disconnect there is we need payments eventually. But like I was saying, I'm not convinced that we ever need everything to be able to be trustless. And the core mission of Bitcoin, which I see in the long term as obviously a monetary tool, a way to save. And I would say as a transaction layer, the Bitcoin main chain is probably going to be more like a settlement tool in the long term. And that might be settlement between bank, major entities, countries. I think we're going to reach a point where it's not normal for the average person to frequently interact with the main chain. And the layers that we're going to have on top of that are going to take a bunch of different forms. And if somebody can figure out all of those UX things, all the problems that we see with Lightning right now, where with Lightning, you kind of have a trade-off right now. You can either make it cheap, working properly, and non-custodial, and you can pretty much do two of those things. So like it's gotten a lot better to the point where like your chances of running a non-custodial payment and getting it through are very high now, but they need to be like nearly 100% for everyone all the time. Because that's just the case with a Visa or something else that takes payments that way. I think there's probably going to be a time when companies like Visa just adopt Bitcoin. And, you can pay a Visa transaction in American dollars and Canadian dollars and euros. And the Visa network works very similarly in all of those cases. And there's no reason that Bitcoin couldn't just be yet another tool that centralized payment processors use. They've got a lot of expertise on how to make payments efficient, how to make the user experience really good. And if they just apply that with Bitcoin and Bitcoin becomes the settlement layer underpinning everything that they're doing, it's actually very easy to improve on a lot of the systems that they've got going now. So like, when you go to a restaurant and you pay with your Visa, depending on the country, depending on the provider and all this stuff, that restaurant might not get paid for your food for like 2-3 days. And it would be very easy to improve on that kind of settlement if Bitcoin was the backing layer to all of that stuff. And that would be meaningful for the merchant who has less of a holdback time and has to have less of a float to run their business. And really for the user, the appeal would be that they're now transacting in the unit of account of Bitcoin. Mm-hmm. And that's the important thing. I think, I think in the long term, we're going to have a mix of hopefully a lot of self-custody with some very good qualified custodians that charge for their services, and people will use those where it fits in with their lives. But in the long term, I see potentially a lot of usefulness for centralized payment networks that attach to Bitcoin and compete meaningfully with those layer twos. And the layer twos either need to like find a giant niche in censorship resistance or improve and compete with a centralized system, or it's never going to move in that direction unless it's at least as good.
I got a couple of thoughts running through my head here because there's two camps, right? The privacy camp of hell no, we can never go down that route. Bitcoin has to remain peer-to-peer, and this is the only way that we ever beat them, and that narrative. And then so what the conversations I've been listening to recently, this one included, and the thought processes that people are going through, it feels to me as though, and I don't want to misquote Nick Szabo, but he's shelling out, excuse me. Although he might retitle it "Shilling Out." His shelling out piece, where he takes you on the journey from collectible to store of value to medium of exchange. Now, collectible and store of value kind of comes under the bracket of hodl. Medium of exchange comes under the bracket of spending your Bitcoin. And on Twitter, we see this a lot now. There is a big conversation going on, spend or replace. Get on zero obviously falls into that bracket as well, because if you're on zero, then you have to go and spend your Bitcoin somehow, whether you can orange pill your merchants or your service providers, or whether you've got to go peer-to-peer and exchange your Bitcoin for fiat, which a lot of people are slowly finding themselves in. So, and listening to you explain what you're seeing and what you're feeling, and then listening to that ARC episode earlier, these are signals to me that we are moving from the store of value into the medium of exchange. Would you, and to quote Obi, who's the founder of Fedi or co-founder of Fedi, you have to, if we want to take this to where we want to take it, you have to make Bitcoin, you have to give Bitcoin more moneyness. And it has to be, like, what can you do? What can you build? What can you make? What can you invent? What service can you provide that makes Bitcoin more of a medium of exchange than purely a store of value? And now, for those of us that have been stacking away as diligently as we can, and fully in the camp of Bitcoin Twitter that has been for the last 5, 6, or 7 years, stack, stay humble, stack, self-custody, do all the right things. At one point, we will have to move over to a medium of exchange. So do you feel that tide? Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah. I think that's the struggle that we're at right now, is we've got a lot of companies and us included at Bitcoin Well. So like one of the things that we do, right now when we're designing our online products, we're focused on making it as like dirt simple as possible to buy or sell Bitcoin. And that's like the core of our product. But we have some other products, and we've got some more stuff that we're working on in the future that really focuses on the usability. So we do bill payments, for example. We can pay, your phone bill or your heating bill or something like that. We allow people to pay those through our service with Bitcoin. And so that expands the usability of Bitcoin. I don't really like that term moneyness, because I think the different characteristics of money are sort of differently weighted for everyone in different circumstances. But outside of that, like, there's a lot of stuff going on in the space right now. And I would include Lightning Network in this, in this group, where like, as well as the stuff that we're building stuff for Bitcoiners. You know what I mean? We're building stuff to make spending money for people who are already enthusiastic about Bitcoin more useful, easier to do, more streamlined, all these things. And as a business owner, as somebody who wants, as a capitalist, I want to build businesses to make money. There's a market there for that, for sure. People want to spend their Bitcoins. They want to have cooler ways to do it. We're seeing all these different cash cards and things like Fold with cash back and stuff like that. There's a huge market there for that stuff. Where I think the confusion is coming that I'm describing here is in tools like Lightning, where I think it's being built mostly for Bitcoiners right now. But what it really needs to be built for, what I'm describing, is it needs to be built for normies. It needs to be built so that it's not a matter of convincing somebody to use this. It's just like, once you show them, they just use it because it's easier or better. And I think we're such a long ways away from that in the transition to medium of exchange. And all of that work is very valuable to get, all these different systems that Bitcoiners can use that will drive that adoption as a payment tool, get on zero, spending your Bitcoins, all that stuff is really good, but it's almost like a dress rehearsal. And it really has to get to a point where, you can't be going into a restaurant trying to sign them up and sell them on the idea of taking Bitcoin if you have to be explaining the trade-offs and like saying, well, yeah, but it's censorship resistant. Well, yeah, but whatever, the details are. And I think that's the one direction we need to build. The counterpoint to all of that is that I kind of think the majority of the world is not going to adopt Bitcoin as a result of the UX or the payment services or the spendability or anything else. I think the majority of the world is going to adopt Bitcoin because it will prevent them from starving to death. And that point that I think is closer than a lot of people think of sort of hyper Bitcoinization, where, we see it in a lot of countries like Venezuela, where they have completely lost confidence in their local currency. They've turned to things like iTunes gift cards, US dollars, more credible ways to store the value. And they're literally doing that because if you try to store money in bolivars, you're not going to be able to buy food tomorrow. And that moment is coming for not only bolivars, but for the Canadian dollar, the euro, the US dollar. And at some point, all of the countries of the world are basically going to have to come to terms with the fact that they've just printed too much and they're not worth anything anymore. I would predict within 5 years, we're probably going to be at about 6 or 7 currencies in the world, like an educated guess. And those ones will fall one by one. And the people in those countries will, they'll switch to Bitcoin at some point. And the sooner they switch, the better they'll do. And hopefully we have good payment services by then. But even if they're no better than they are today, they're still going to switch because of the economic necessity of being able to have no other way to store value over time.
So what's your rallying cry to the plebs that are listening to the show?
Well, rallying cry to the plebs. What I just said sort of obviates the need for any rallying cry. We don't need to do anything. We need to take the decisions that will be best for ourselves and our families and operate in the world as capitalists, trying to provide value in exchange for value. And that's sort of where I think the majority of the plebs and the Bitcoiners should focus their time, is in making themselves useful, earning money, providing value to others, and then storing that value in Bitcoin. There's a massive opportunity from a business standpoint to provide the kind of merchant services that don't exist right now that I'm talking about, wherein it is at least as good as Apple Pay. And so if somebody has a vision to take us to at least as good as Apple Pay, like pretty soon, that sounds like a really good idea. And, I hope that Lightning Network continues to improve. I hope that ARC is not going to take 4 years to release. And I hope that movement continues in those directions. And I wouldn't dissuade anyone from working on those things, but my hopes don't lie in that direction. My hopes lie in the hard money features of Bitcoin. That's why I think Bitcoin is going to be successful. And whether we as entrepreneurs in the Bitcoin industry do a good job or a poor job of making it useful, Bitcoin will succeed either way. It's just going to change the lives of those of us who use it in the meantime.
So let's talk about how the landscape of starting a Bitcoin business has changed since you started all those years ago.
Yeah.
No one was giving you seed money, I'm assuming, back in those days.
No, that's why I had to spend my own Bitcoins. Yeah, I mean, there was no seed, there was no funding of any kind for Bitcoin businesses. The very basics of Bitcoin were unknown to the general population back then. So like when we first opened a store, we had to give our new potential landlord a tutorial on we had to explain that we're not just some fly by night, boiler room chop shop selling fake investments. We had to explain that Bitcoin was a real thing and that, we intended to start a real business and this is what it was going to do. That was true for banking. We have spent years trying to get good banking in Canada, which we still don't really have, but it's a lot better than it used to be, I guess. It was hard to find a lawyer or an accountant or anyone providing any kind of professional services that had even heard of Bitcoin back then. So there's a whole world of sort of support services around the industry that make it a lot smoother to start a company. And there are, like you mentioned, there's a lot of funding out there. So you see things like Betty, where, they just raised a boatload of money, and there are rational venture capitalists seeking to invest in Bitcoin focused companies over kind of like the crypto focused companies. And they do that knowing they're not going to get the 1000x that they might get in a new crypto or a new crypto company. So we're starting to see amongst venture capitalists a lot more like long-term thinking, low time preference choices, and more money that has now been burned in the crypto space is cautiously starting to look back at our space again. And I think like that's a journey that a lot of people have been through personally, where, you get into the space. I'm sure you've had this thing where you talk to somebody about Bitcoin, like an old friend or an acquaintance or something like that. And you spend like 2 years telling them they should get into Bitcoin. And then they're like, guess what? I got into Bitcoin. I bought some Doge. and you're like, oh. So a lot of the time people go through that journey where they go down those shitcoin paths and then they get burned inevitably. And either they just write off the whole space entirely and go back to their fiat world, or they come back around and they use that as a learning experience and become Bitcoiners. And, I think that's, sorry, what was our initial question on that one?
Well, I was just saying how the landscape is so different. So entrepreneurs are out there listening, or plebs who are just thinking, shit, I've got an idea that fixes something in Bitcoin. It's a completely different landscape to now than it was years ago. I mean, it's still not easy to get funding, but it is at least available.
Yeah, exactly. That's where I was going with that. Is you've got this world of venture capitalists making those same kind of choices and choosing to invest in companies that make those choices themselves as well, that work on building a company, that try to focus on making more money than they spend, that don't just build a forever money losing company attempting to create stats to support the next time they're going to raise money to support the losing money of the company. That's kind of like the fiat venture capital model. And there's a lot more companies going in that direction. So if you wanted to raise money for a Bitcoin company, the number of places you could go to raise the money is really limited compared to like if you had an AI startup today. Mm-hmm. But it's like 10 years ago, there were none. It was trying to convince a regular VC firm that Bitcoin's not a scam, essentially. And so, I think there's a lot of different options. There's a lot of good advisors in the space too. There's so much good information out there at this point, both about businesses, about the industry, about Bitcoin itself. And so there's when I got started, there was there was probably a time when I had read every single thing that had ever been written about Bitcoin in the world, which is crazy. The entire Bitcoin talk forum, and there wasn't that much stuff. Now there's just an absolutely unlimited amount of information that is out there to anybody who wants to get involved in any level in Bitcoin. And also, there's sort of an entire generation of Bitcoin entrepreneurs that have either stepped away or are now doing venture capital or operating as advisors and stuff like that. So there's a ton of good advice to be had out there too. And that'd be probably one of the biggest things that I would recommend, especially for somebody with a traditional business background, especially for somebody with an MBA, is if you want to start a Bitcoin business, get some advice from some really good Bitcoiners, because there's lots. And there are a whole bunch of weird problems that we've solved or worked around or attempted to solve in the space that like banking that I mentioned or things like that people new to the space they have no idea how to figure those things out.
Which we don't know your rabbit hole story yet. Usually we've done that by now on one of the Once Bitten podcasts, but 2000, What were you doing pre 2010? And you feel free to share your age if you're happy to. But and give us what was Fiat Dave up to in those decades before discovering Bitcoin?
Yeah. So I'm 40, and I've been in like full time in the Bitcoin industry now for a decade, and I would say I've been in Bitcoin since 2010. I mean, I've been a hustler and an entrepreneur my whole life. So before I got into Bitcoin, I was running a recycling company here in Calgary, and closed down some parts of that and sold off some other parts. And right around the time when I was just getting into Bitcoin and was starting to sell it on the side and that kind of stuff.
Recycling being like the government kind of arm of that side of the trash. How did that work?
Yeah. So we were the, Calgary was the last major city in North America to have a government recycling program. Mm-hmm. So we were like a private company that offered a recycling program to like homes and businesses who wanted to recycle in addition to their trash kind of thing. Right. So we had a bunch of trucks going around collecting this stuff, and we would take it to the different places to get recycled. And, I learned a lot about recycling. I learned that recycling is pretty much a giant scam.
Yes.
So
that's where I wanted you to go. I was hoping you would go there.
Yeah.
Because we need to lift the skirt on what is actually going on with the recycling, because people are still being gaslit to this day. Where we live here in France, you've got like 5 separate bins for different shit. And it's like, this makes no sense. So can you really get into the weeds and the dirty, disgusting nature of this whole recycling scam?
There's recycling is an example of the Cobra effect, which is a concept that afflicts every decision that every government has made in the history of the world. And it's essentially, I end up telling the story every time I'm on a podcast, basically, but I'll tell it quickly. It's essentially in the 1700s, the British were ruling India, and there was a problem with too many cobras in Delhi. And so they put a bounty on the cobras, which seems pretty rational, but they ended up pricing it way too high because they didn't really understand their local economy. And it was like 3 months of salary for one cobra. And so you ended up with this newly rich class of cobra hunters who very quickly ran out of cobras, and being capitalists, they then became cobra farmers.
Exactly.
And we're just farming the cobras and handing them in. And they went for a long time doing that until the British caught them, essentially, and they canceled the cobra bounty program. And then at that point, the cobra farmers just released all their cobras. And so now there's way more cobras than when they started. And that was basically the exact opposite outcome of what they tried to do, right? So they took a fairly simple, seemingly direct action with one outcome in mind. And because they were unable to anticipate one fairly simple second order effect, they had the exact opposite outcome of what they were trying to do. Right. And that's literally like you see, like Francis and Madex. I don't know. He might have been on your show.
Madex says, I'm going to have to bag Francis pretty soon. Now you've been on to.
So it doesn't, it's not going to show up in the audio here, but I've got an amazing Madex piece behind me on the screen. Right. You see some of us on Twitter sometimes saying like, oh, there's a risk of cobras, and the risk of cobras is the risk of unintended consequences. And we're seeing that with ordinals. We're now reaping the consequences of some unintended effects of segregated witness and taproot that we didn't anticipate at the time. And it comes down to this idea that I don't think humans are very well suited to understand, design, model, or effectively alter in a meaningful way complex systems. So things like the economy, an ecosystem, the environment, the climate, a pandemic. We just frankly have no idea what we're talking about. And when the experts pretend to have an idea what they're talking about, they almost always create more problems than they're trying to solve. And recycling is an example of that for the most part. when we were doing recycling, we picked up metal, plastic, glass, and paper. And metal makes a lot of sense to recycle because it's very hard to get more metal. And if you can just recuperate the tin from people's tin cans, that's way cheaper than mining it from the earth. And it saves resources, saves time, saves money, makes a ton of sense. Paper is also economically viable to recycle. Granted, I'm talking numbers from 15 years ago here, but we used to get paid a little bit of money for paper. And it made a certain degree of sense. But that said, paper comes from an entirely renewable resource, which in most cases gets wasted these days. Trees are not going to run out. But it probably makes sense to recycle paper. It's a net economic benefit. Glass, there's no benefit whatsoever to recycle glass. It's entirely inert. If you put glass in the landfill, it's just going to turn back into sand.
Right.
And there's not much that you could do with it. And the world is also just not going to run out of sand. It's the most plentiful element on Earth. And so there's plenty of glass to go around. So it's neither here nor there whether you recycle your glass, but the big scam is the plastics recycling. And that is a big portion of the recycling by volume. It was about 30-40% when I was doing recycling. And the problem being, when you recycle paper, you can throw technically your newspaper and your cardboard and everything in, and it'll all just get mixed around and it'll work itself out. But when you recycle plastics, you've got several different polymers. You've got these different little recycling codes on the bottom of them. And then you have a bunch of different additives and dyes, and you really can't mix those things. And in some cases, it can actually be dangerous to mix different plastics with each other. If you have a piece of PVC pipe, the C in PVC stands for chlorine. And so, chloride. And so, if you end up with PVC pipe in your styrofoam recycling, it might release chlorine gas to the recycling plant. And, that's obviously not a good outcome. So it's really difficult to recycle plastics properly. And I don't think anyone's actually doing it. Like I said, we used to get paid for the metal that we would pick up. We would get paid for the paper. We would drop off our glass for free. But we would pay a lot of money to a company that would export the plastics to China. They would bale it into these giant bales of mixed plastics. They were not separated by polymer or anything. And they would ship them off to China. And in massive, massive quantities. And this is what most of North America is doing with our plastic, is shipping it to China. But it's not unless they've got just armies of people over there literally separating every single piece by the polymer, by the dye, by the consistency and all these things, it's just not a realistic thing that they're going to be doing. And the kind of products you can make by recycling a big mess of mixed plastics like that are quite limited. And the fact is they just don't make that much stuff like that. So where's all the plastics going? And what I suspect is happening is they're just taking the payment from North America to recycle it and then going into international waters and just dumping it in the ocean. And I would guess that, we've got this Great Pacific Garbage Patch that is floating in the ocean full of straws and stuff. I bet you that is what's floating above a much larger pile of baled plastics at the bottom. And, I don't have any proof that they're doing this, but I see all of the incentives do not line up for recycling to actually take place. And I see no signs that recycling is actually taking place of these plastics at scale like that. So it's just cobras. There's fucking cobras everywhere, basically.
And my tin hat, putting my tin hat on, it all ties back to those people that own the oil industries, that lobby the governments, that put the subsidies in place, that just keeps the great big wheel turning. And maybe they're dumping it, maybe they're just burning it. Right?
Who knows? It could be either of those things. It does not make sense that there is a large scale global plastics manufacturing industry recycling most of the plastic that's collected. It's just not realistic.
Everything's a lie, guys. Everything.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's gotten to the point where, we've seen so many so-called conspiracy theories come true over the last few years.
Spoiler alert.
I'm almost willing to entertain anything. Like I see no evidence that the earth is flat or that we're ruled by lizard people, but like, I'm not going to entirely write it off because of just like, I don't doubt that the malice and incompetence to perpetrate almost any lie is there. Like those who are currently in control of the world would say or do anything to maintain their current status quo. And that there's no conspiracy that is too heinous or too far-fetched to be something that those people would at least attempt to perpetrate.
By any means necessary.
Yes.
All right. So we've done that recycling scam. That's what you were part of. How did Bitcoin present itself to you then? Like you're sitting there sorting through number 1s, 2s, and 3s, plastic milk bottle tops, and
I was looking up a graphics card, a GPU for gaming, and this was right around the time that GPU mining had become a thing in Bitcoin. And so I'm reading these forums, and somebody's like, "Hey, if you buy this one, you can mine Bitcoin." And I was like, "Oh, like what's that?" And then ended up buying a more expensive card. And then right after I bought the card, Bitcoin went from $1 to $14 in like a week. And so the card paid for itself super fast. And I was like, this is a great thing to do. And so I was like, I filled up my basement with graphics cards and I was mining Bitcoins and then selling them on local Bitcoins, basically.
All right. So hang on. Gaming, what were you into before we get into the mining Bitcoin stuff? Like, was that something you were like fully down the rabbit hole of, and this is part of your not growing up?
Not really. Yeah, like I grew up with gaming a fair bit. I was never obsessed with it like I see some people obsessed with it these days, where they're putting like their whole lives into Call of Duty or whatever it is. But I was definitely a big fan of gaming, and I've always been a nerd and into computers. And like, I wanted to, I don't know what game I was hoping to play, but, I wanted to do more gaming of some kind. And then, it started out as like an excuse to spend more money on the gaming card. And then very quickly turned into like, a side hustle. Like I got into it purely as a way to make some extra money. A lot of people still do get into it for that reason these days, but nowadays you've at least got a lot of information to be able to teach you what Bitcoin is and why it's here. Back then there was no Bitcoin standard, there was no like bullish case for Bitcoin or other things that I would point people to now if they want to get a firm like philosophical foundational grounding of like what Bitcoin is and why it's important and how it fits into the world. Back then it was like a fairly small community, and a lot of the narrative around why Bitcoin was important really centered around payments back then. It was a fast, cheap payments tool. And we see, a lot of the people that would have been considered like the influencers in the space or the big names, like almost all of them are gone and disgraced nowadays, like the Roger Vers and Mike Hearns and Gavin Andersons and whoever else. They all took stances at one point or another that Bitcoin was supposed to be a Visa competitor, more so than a competitor to the Federal Reserve or the central banks of the world.
So you get the card and it's funny because I listened to your episode that you sent across with Matt Odell, and he brought up the fact that you say Bitcoins instead of Bitcoin, and there's a big divide out there. I mean, it is clear to me why you use the plural, because if you were mining Bitcoin in 2010 with a GPU card, like there's Bitcoins, there's 50 of them, like they just rain out of the sky. Of course it's plural. Whereas now, if you want to buy a Bitcoin, you're going to have $25,000 on the hip. That's not, we're in different worlds.
Yeah. And I think he's right about that one. I'm trying to correct myself from saying Bitcoins, but it's just,
but why?
It still feels natural.
Of course, because it's natural to your era. I mean, it might be a red flag for somebody that's like, oh, you must have a shit ton, but from my point of view, when you come across people that have been in Bitcoin space from a certain time, they will use the plural, and that's a tell. So maybe you do want to change it if you're looking for more OPSEC stuff. Maybe that's Matt's point. I'm not sure.
Yeah, my OPSEC's not that good.
No.
I don't think... Yeah, I mean, going on podcasts is not good for your OPSEC.
And having been around Bitcoin for as long as you have, and, you told Lauren, in 2013, I sold 120 Bitcoin for some furniture. Bitcoins, to quote you. I sold 120 Bitcoins for some furniture. I mean, poor Pierre Rochard, he's going to be listening to this and like, what? You bought chairs with Bitcoin? Like, what the fuck are you thinking? But again, different eras, different times. And here we are trying to figure out how to navigate ourselves through this thing, getting stuck a lot of the time in some very important fights, but also some very non-important fights. So the important one, obviously, the block size wars, which you would have had a front seat of, I'm assuming. What was going on in your mind, in your neck of the woods, and where were you kind of falling on that battle, and who were you following and supporting, and how did you see a catastrophic end, or did you think this is going to be talked out, we're going to get there? Do you remember your feelings?
Yeah, I do. So that was right around the time that I started becoming good friends with Francis, and we were really talking about these issues a lot more. We wrote this thing maybe like 2015, 2016, somewhere in there, that was basically against this proposal called Bitcoin Unlimited. And we wrote a letter. It's still online. If you Google Canada rejects Bitcoin Unlimited or something like that. We wrote this piece, and we got about 15 or 16 other Canadian companies to sign this letter, basically saying that Canada rejects the Bitcoin Unlimited proposal. And that was a little bit of a groundswell in that, like, it kind of got the first steps of what later became the UASF going, I think, in that people saw this, like, let's all get together and say no to these things. And my first thoughts at the time were that, we just need to make the right decisions. We need to choose the right things. And I thought that there might be some reasonableness, a reasonable middle ground to be found with something like the SegWit 2x. Maybe we need to raise the block size. We also implement SegWit and we get a middle ground there. And then when that actual proposal came out, the SegWit 2x, which was basically like, you got like a bunch of big miners and all the big Bitcoin companies were having drinks and cocaine together around the consensus conference. And they decided that they should make some decision for the benefit of Bitcoin. And that process, where they got together and in a closed door boardroom to make decisions that affected me and my business and what was a very important part of my life already at that point, Bitcoin. That was the part that was alarming to me, that like these guys think they're in charge and they can just get together. And the response to that, the UASF, the user activated soft fork, which is, it almost worked out that you had like, maybe like the 30 biggest companies in Bitcoin along with the big miners on one side. And then you had like the 300 next smaller companies on the other side, along with the plebs. And it was kind of like just a game of chicken. And our side won, and we got the UASF through, we got SegWit implemented, which at the time felt like a massive victory. And in some ways it was. It was a victory that we didn't allow the cabal of cocaine fueled bankers to dictate the future of Bitcoin. And it was a win in that there was like a groundswell of popular opinion that was able to make a choice like that. And that I thought was a positive. But ultimately, as we're seeing now, we got some cobras out of that, right? We didn't know what the repercussions would be. And so in retrospect, when I look back at that stuff, we went from a catastrophically bad or a potentially catastrophically bad decision-making model, which was the banksters and the Coinbases of the world, etc., and like some very very shiny foreheads. There's for some reason a lot of very bald men in the shitcoin executive world. So those guys making the decision would have been worse, but I don't know that it's a good thing that there was the way to make that decision the way that we made the decision either. And we're seeing those consequences there. And I think that's one of the biggest threats facing Bitcoin now. We're seeing that with the activation of Taproot and, the potential consequences thereof and the way that was activated with the speedy trial. I don't know what the best way at all to make decisions about the future of Bitcoin is. I do know that we have been doing a less than perfect, somewhat poor job of making those decisions. And I don't have confidence that we're going to make better decisions in the future. And I don't know what the answer to that is. I don't know if there's like a better decision-making process. Part of me says that we should just stop and not change anything. There's a bunch of people that I have a lot of respect for who have a lot more technical understanding than I do, that are very in favor of more upcoming changes that they think will bring us to a point where we need to get to for a minimum long-term viability from a technical standpoint. And I want to listen to those people. And my instinct tells me they're probably right, but I also don't know how we should reach a consensus that we actually make those changes in a way that does not become central planning. That's the only thing that can kill Bitcoin at this point is central planning.
Which is us.
Yeah, which is us.
It's funny. Somebody texted me today and said, what do you think is the biggest threat to Bitcoin? Is it quantum computing? Is it this, that, and the other thing? And my response was, no, it's us.
Yeah.
And that is so evident with what's happening in the last 2 or 3 months. And this whole ordinals thing. And Udi and Eric claiming to have broken Bitcoin. Last time I checked, it's not broken. I mean, when he made that tweet thread, the average block time was 10 minutes and 1 second.
Yeah,
you have a pretty much perfect system going right now.
Yeah,
even with the history that you've just summarized there.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest single risk, because the ordinals thing is in a couple ways an example of incentives that exist outside of the Bitcoin network acting upon the Bitcoin network. And that's part of the problem with the way that they're going around the mempool and submitting these things directly to miners and stuff like that. We've created a scenario where all of these incentives, and the fiat world is nothing but a giant ball of twisted incentives. And the more that we let those incentives get into Bitcoin and affect the decisions of people who themselves can affect Bitcoin, the more risk that we're at for fiat corrupting the whole thing. Like Fiat has corrupted pretty much the entire world.
Mm-hmm.
And Bitcoin is, at a technical level, uncorruptible, but the consensus that underpins Bitcoin is made up of a whole bunch of humans, and we are absolutely corruptible. So that's the hardest part that we have coming up, is to try to find a way to, do as little as possible, but still have a way for the network to respond and potentially grow to different new technologies. But I think, like, it's got to be led with caution. It's got to be, I personally, and I can only affect my own decisions, I'm going to take a lot of convincing before I think we should ever have another change to the Bitcoin network. And I'm open to the idea, and I'm willing to listen to why people say we might want to change, but it's going to have to be pretty good. It's going to have to be good reason.
So let's bring this back to Bitcoin Well and what you're doing right now. Because you said that kind of dirty word, like we took the company public. So I'm sure the listeners are going to want to know, like, why did you decide to take the company public and enter possibly the biggest casino in the world, which is the stock exchange? You're listed on the Canadian Stock Exchange, is that correct?
Yeah.
Yep. Which is, a shark full of fiat incentives, and you've got to live quarter to quarter. This is clearly something you thought about long and hard. So what was that thought process? Why did you go public? Why did you list? And let's take us on that journey.
Yeah. So that's part of why I joined the company that's now Bitcoin Well. That was why Adam, the CEO and founder of Bitcoin Well, he asked me to join, was to go through that process, taking it public. And I've never gone through that. I've never been part of a public company before, but I had a little bit of experience with capital markets, and I have a keen nose for bullshit, and I don't let people bully me easily. So I think those characteristics made sense to dare the public markets. And the whole goal, like, when you see a bull run with Bitcoin, and Bitcoin goes from like $20,000 to like $80,000 or something like that, and we've got, we make way more money. The entire industry makes way more money, and everybody's very enthusiastic. There's lots of cool stuff going on, and that only lasts for like a few months every 4 years, right? It seems. But while that's happening, the valuations on companies that deal in Bitcoin go even more insane. So you have companies that, like a good example is there's a company called Blockchain Intelligence Group, which has a kind of a shitty blockchain analysis software, but they also run a Bitcoin exchange. And through the last bull run, like they went from something like $40 million market cap to $1 billion in a matter of months. And that's sort of the idea, is to tap into something like that. There are a lot of companies, like we mentioned Swan previously, like Swan is the company that has done a very good job of fitting into the fiat world and being able to play the fiat games in order to fund the development of Bitcoin and Bitcoiner focused products that I think are pretty ideologically aligned with most of the space. And, not everybody likes the fact that they go down those rabbit holes and play those fiat games. We decided to do it too for that, basically that same reason. You know what I mean? Is you get a potential short-term opportunity for really, really asymmetric access to capital. And if you can raise money when you've got those completely ridiculous valuations, you can basically use that money the entire bear market to keep growing the company. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of the game that we're trying to play. We're trying to balance those two things. And we just missed the last bull run. So like from our perspective, it hasn't been worth it at all. Like it's been a huge time and money sink to go public. I had somebody tell me a little while before we did this, he was like, somebody that I trust who's got some experience in this area. And he's like, well, you shouldn't go public unless you really, really need the money or you're completely insane. And I guess we were completely insane. And so we decided to try it. And it's like, I've got a lot more insight into it now. I could do a way better job of it doing it a second time or something like that. And I think there are cases where it makes a certain degree of sense, but there are a lot of cases where it does not make sense. And so you see some guys like Francis, who's never raised any outside money, or like Steve Barber, Upstream Data is another good friend of mine who talks a lot about staying away from the fiat games. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of value in that, and taking a company that has never really had exposure to the leverage, the valuation games, the dirty tricks they play with stats and all this stuff that comes in the venture capital, be it private equity, public markets, that whole traditional financial system. It's essentially attracted a large group of people who make money off of the productivity of others. And it takes a proportionally larger and larger chunk of the world's resources, the financialization of everything, really, right? It, in theory, adds efficiency to capital allocation. That's what the whole thing's supposed to be there to do. But I think all in all, it's a giant leech on society. But there's still potential benefits in the individual circumstances. If you want to run a Bitcoin company and you want to go into the belly of the beast and try to squeeze some dollars out of that system, you can probably grow faster. But it's not easy. And it's kind of a minefield. I think there's a lot of companies that go down either the venture capital route or the public markets route or both that end up essentially getting eaten alive because their passion is building an app or something like that, especially technical founders that don't have as much business experience, I guess, or as much sort of legal experience behind them. They can really get sucked into this stuff and taken advantage of by people who are there to extract a fee. And the best of them are there to extract a fee by providing value, but a lot of them are just there to extract a fee however they can and move on to the next. They're mosquitoes.
So when you must have a view on, because you've now done it from the beginning. When Saylor announced, he was already 20 or 25 years as CEO and then took the company onto a Bitcoin standard. And, we know the story. How do you view them as a Bitcoin company, or do you view that as a software company that has Bitcoin on the balance sheet? And how do you think about when we go into this next bull run, probably pre or post halving, whenever it happens, what's it going to do to their stock price? Do you view them differently or the same?
They're a pretty interesting one there too, where they have done exactly what I was talking about, where they've gone into the belly of the beast. They've used this massive history that he's got with public markets and the software company. They've basically leveraged all of that social and financial capital that they've created over however long they've been running that business to buy as much Bitcoin as possible. So when you look at when they were raising some of that money and, they're essentially raising long-term convertible debt that converts at the company's option. So, and that part is pretty rare to have the company option on the full amount of the convertible debt. So they're playing the fiat games properly, I think. Essentially, you're going to have one of two outcomes there. The more likely outcome on a 10-year time frame, like they're talking with this convertible debt, is that the Bitcoins that they buy with the money they raised are going to be worth way more money in 10 years, way more dollars in 10 years, right? And if that's the case, then they always just have the option to just sell a small portion of the Bitcoins and pay back the entire debt. But because that conversion happens at the company's option, that gives them a lot of optionality. If the price of Bitcoin were to collapse, they just go ahead and convert the debt to shares, which would be dilution for the shareholders. But the risk becomes entirely different, because in that scenario where they go ahead and convert to shares, the shareholders have already probably lost a lot of value, because the company's most of the value in the company is in the Bitcoins that are sitting there, right? And in the longer term, if we see a future where Bitcoin continues to go up, that's only going to keep going. It's just going to get more extreme, especially as they keep buying more and more Bitcoins. So I think they're doing it right. And if, they set the blueprint for a bunch of other companies, but also I hope countries. And we see things like El Salvador, where it's very positive that they are holding Bitcoins. It's positive that they want to invest in the space. I don't know if I would say it's positive that they are forcing people to take Bitcoin backed by violence in the form of legal tender. That's not a great positive to me. But I think the next step beyond that is a country that actually takes their currency and replaces it with Bitcoin, not just holding it as a reserve asset. And like I mentioned before, I think we're going to be in for a world with a lot fewer currencies. I think a lot of the small currencies in the world are bound for failure fairly soon. We're seeing Lebanon and all these other countries, Argentina, that are like near the edge of the cliff. I think more countries that we know are kind of in that like Wile E. Coyote moment where they've like run out across past the edge of the cliff and they just haven't realized that they're supposed to start falling yet. And that's what I think we're going to see is these small countries will have to make a choice between moving to a regional currency where, we see like that's the case in El Salvador, right? They're on the US dollar. There are a lot of countries around the world that are already on regional currencies. As these countries lose the ability to make up for their fiscal shortcomings with monetary policy, as they lose the ability to just print more money so they can spend more money, I see them having to come up with a couple different choices. One of them is some form of revaluation backed by debt, maybe IMF loans or different things that come with all kinds of promises and conditions like what we're seeing in Argentina. And the other choice, which I think hopefully will become more apparent to more of these countries, is that because they've already lost that lever, the monetary lever that they've been using to backstop their spending for so many years. And once they've lost it, now their choice is like, without that lever present anyway, what's the best money for the country? And in a lot of cases right now, that's probably realistically those regional currencies, at least from a usability standpoint and what people are familiar with and a volatility standpoint. But I think there will come a time in the not too distant future where one of those countries that has to make that choice says, we're not actually going to move to the yuan. We're going to move to Bitcoin. And we've accumulated 400,000 Bitcoins. And that's now going to back this new banknotes that we are going to issue that are numbered and auditable. And, it's kind of like a layer of fiat on top of Bitcoin, but it's at least an auditable layer of fiat. And I think if one country makes that move, it's really the same move that Saylor has made with MicroStrategy, where they basically put all of the value of the company into Bitcoin. If a country does that, the resulting impact on the price that would probably follow that almost immediately would very likely cause more countries to do the same thing. And the first ones that do it are going to look really smart. They're going to probably end up being some of the richest countries in the world permanently if they're able to accumulate a large number of Bitcoins using their own fiat reserves and fiat technology. So that's kind of where I see that going, is like, it is going to be a reserve asset, both for countries and companies. And I'm kind of surprised actually that we haven't seen more like big tech companies, that kind of thing, taking that leap. And, it's probably going to take until Saylor's way in the green again before we see another wave of those, but, it's going to happen again someday.
And again, it just makes you wonder how captured those particularly big FANG stocks are by those who pull their strings and say, no, you're not adopting Bitcoin. Like, fine. Whereas nobody knew who Saylor was or who MicroStrategy were until that big release in September 2020, announcing the August purchase.
Yeah,
and now you just talk about Saylor and MicroStrategy to your normie friends, even those who are pretty much well versed in stock market. Like, yeah, what, who, when, why, what are you talking? Why are you shilling me this stock? Like, oh,
yeah,
it's again, it's just a reminder of how early we are in this.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think the big FANGs and those ones are probably going to be among the first to move in a meaningful way. I think that like the vast majority of the economy exists in companies more similar in size to MicroStrategy. There are countless companies worth hundreds of millions or a few $1 billion that are really very large, significant, successful companies. Some of them we've heard of, some of them we've never heard of. And the ones that we've never heard of vastly outnumber the ones that we have heard of. Yeah. And those companies make up the backbone of the economy and they make a lot of money. So I think in a lot of cases, companies in those sizes are more likely to have founders that are still in control or very close to in control. And they're likely to have smaller decision-making bases that don't necessarily rely on like their quarterly communication with BlackRock or whoever the case may be. And those companies in that sort of area, I think, will be the ones that we see in the next rush towards corporate balance sheet Bitcoin. And in the same way, I would say that we're probably going to see countries in those same ranges. Not even the next step I see is not even necessarily going to be the smallest countries out there, like the tiny little El Salvador or whatever. I think there's going to be a point somewhere where we start to see smallish, medium-sized countries dumping on there. And, the term gradually, then suddenly, I think really applies. Like it's not going to be predictable. It's not going to be like, we can say that it's going to come at some point. Like there's probably going to be no idea when it's going to come, and it might come overnight. Like it might be just an absolute deluge of, once one country adopts Bitcoin as its national currency, and all of a sudden every single person in the country is 3 times richer than they were a week ago.
Right.
Like that's pretty good for the economy.
Which is the opposite to what happened here when we switched to the euro. And everyone was 3 times poorer because they just had all of their wealth completely, annihilated. And some centralized being said, right, this is now worth that. And we're going to put this person's head on the notes and the coins instead of that person. Really. And it would be a complete reverse situation.
Yeah. And it's what we've seen in the, we're in this period in North America, and it's really centered around sort of like the US empire, where there's a lot of parallels going on to sort of like the fall of Rome, right? Like we're seeing purchasing power eroded at a rate that's never been eroded before. So what you're describing with the switch to the euro, like something very similar is happening to most of the rest of the world over the last 3 years with the massive money printing tied to COVID and all this stuff. We're seeing the opposite of that without even switching currencies. We're seeing everyone losing their purchasing power, and that shift hasn't even really worked its way all the way into the economy yet. So all of the consequences of the changes in purchasing power, the changes in borrowing power, those haven't really shaken out because a lot of people are still living in homes at old interest rates and operating on car loans at old interest rates. And there's a degree of sort of like legacy pricing that has to shake itself out of the economy. And it's going to really only get worse. And as most of the countries of the world continue to go through that, where we're losing half of our purchasing power every couple of years, the country that suddenly sees the opposite happen is going to look very appealing. And that second wave, we're probably going to have one country that goes first. The second wave that comes after that one is going to be the one that is the then suddenly portion of it, I think, which, that's the point at which people will start looking at it as a survival tool rather than an investment.
Dave, we've been going almost 2 hours, man. I'm going to have to ask we're going to have to ask you the last question. Otherwise, we'll just keep going.
Yeah.
If you had one last orange pill left to give to somebody, who would you give that to and why?
Oh, that's a good one. I don't think I want to say first, it doesn't really matter. Like my first instinct was along the lines of what we were talking about. Like maybe it should be, a world leader somewhere that I find ideologically aligned. But I think the person that would be most interesting to me would be Russell Brand. And I've followed him a lot lately. I find that he's one of the most effective and intellectually honest communicators out there right now. And most of what he says sounds like he's a Bitcoiner. And he talks about, transparency and truth and holding the powers that be accountable. And he's just missing the tool, right? He's missing the tool that we've all discovered in Bitcoin that and I think most people in the Bitcoin space believe will be, I think this is a Safety quote, the technology that finally ends World War I. Right. It's what will get us out of this spiral of the ever increasing scope and insidiousness of collectiveness. Like the communists are trying to take every scrap of value we have and every shred of dignity from our lives, and they're winning quite resoundingly at this point. And I believe that in the long term, they're not going to win. And the main reason for that is Bitcoin, because they're just not going to be able to pay for it.
Excellent answer. Russell, what the hell are you doing? So many British plebs have been beating the drum. Get him on the pod. Would you please listen? He was on Joe Rogan recently. I watched that one, and it is so frustrating to see somebody so close. But, you have to have faith that they will trip up and bang their head against it. I mean, Rogan himself, he's had multiple people on, Andreas included, back in the day as well. It's so
Rogan's a Bitcoiner. I'm like 100% on that. He's mentioned briefly, like, I own some Bitcoins. He's talked about it enough. He's delivered effective talking points enough, and he has his own reasons to want to keep that quiet, which might be his own personal privacy and his financial freedom. It might be something to do with the fact that he does have corporate overlords that pay him a nice 9 figures. That's a good reason not to talk about something.
Yep.
And so it could be any of those things. And any of those are fine. I don't get the sense that that's true with Russell Brand. I think there's just like a mental block somewhere. And it's probably something simple, like his cousin got burned on Doge. Like it's usually when people have, usually when people are like 90, 95% of the way there on understanding Bitcoin, the thing that they are stuck on is like a personal detail in my experience.
All right, man, let's close this one down. But how can people come and find you and interact? And if there's anybody listening here that thinks they can add value to you in any way, what's the best way to get in touch?
Yeah, absolutely. You can get me as Bitcoin Brains on Twitter. That's super easy way to find me. That's where I'm mostly interacting. I'm also on Nostr, but I haven't been using it much lately because Twitter is returning to some semblance of sanity and quality. Although I'm still very, very bullish on the idea of Nostr. You can also find me on my personal brand website at bitcoinbrains.com. There's a lot of very important information there that I think everyone should read. And you can find Bitcoin Well at bitcoinwell.com, and the conference is the Bitcoin Rodeo on Twitter, and bitcoinrodeo.com for tickets to that conference.
Wow, man. Thank you for everything you've done on behalf of the community in the Bitcoin space. It's great to know. It's great to meet people that have been around for so long and be so open about it and share the stories and the trials and tribulations, because I know there is, for every one of you, there's probably another 100 that are just living their best life somewhere and not contributing to education or trying to push this thing forward. And for that, you need to be commended, and big kudos to you. Thank you for everything that you're doing.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for having me.
All right, man. Have a great day.
All right, take care.
Well, guys, hope you enjoyed that interview with Dave. Thank you for coming on again and sharing all of that information. If you guys want to reach out to Dave, his Twitter handle is in the show title there. You will be able to just DM him, follow him, send him a DM. It's at Bitcoin Brains. And let's get going. Let's keep building. We need more and more people out there getting released from their fiat lives and building together. And as I keep saying, the best way to do that is with a team of people that you truly trust and are happy to spend a lot of time with, and they're Bitcoiners. So you got to go and meet those Bitcoiners, because if you don't meet those Bitcoiners, you're never going to release yourself from the fiat day-to-day. So get on Orange Pill app, guys. It's so simple, because you could easily find somebody within a 50-mile radius and just get out and meet them. If not, get to a conference. You know what's coming up. The Hodl Hodl Baltic Honey Badger Conference is going to be the start of September. You can use the link and the discount code BITten in the show notes to save yourself 10% on those tickets. It's such a great event. It's very well thought of within a community, a lot of OGs, and you get to speak with these people, you know, like it's not like they're hiding away. They're walking around the conference, having conversations. They're in the pubs or in the bars or in the restaurants after the event, and it's just brilliant. If you want to get across to Prague, check out Free Cities Foundation. They're throwing their Liberty in Our Lifetime conference again. And I love this one because it brings parallel structures together. Who are the homeschoolers? Who are the homesteaders? Who are the people building communities in different countries? Who are the seasteaders? Who the hell would live on a sea pod? But it's freaking fun to learn about what's going on in Prosper and Roatan, and what's going on in other places around the world where Free Cities Foundation are trying to set up free trade zones and, you know, very, very intentional contractual living where you can go and actually own property, for example. Private property rights being the top of their bill. So it's worth getting along to and having a look at. You can head over to that link in the show notes and use the code BITTEN to get a 10% discount. And make sure you're stacking Swan, Relay, Coin Corner, and Hodl Hodl. They're all great Bitcoin-only companies. They're there to help you out. Wasabi is there to help you out with the Coin Join. If you've been around for a little while and you want to look into coin joining your legacy stack, or any Bitcoin that you might be getting at new now and pulling off of exchanges, it's wasabiwallet.io, where you can go and learn about that and test that out for yourself. Make sure you've self-custodied, use the Bitbox 02, and get over to mempool.space. If nothing more, to educate yourself more and more about what's going on, what goes on in each block. Like, so many have been filled up with these tiny little transactions, which have been all this ordinal craze, which is slowly petering out. We're almost back down to 1 sat per byte. If you don't know what that means, don't worry. Get over there, because mempool.space will explain it to you. And finally, Consensus Network. Thank you guys for everything that you are doing. This podcast will be now hosted on their YouTube channel, so you'll be able to go up to Consensus Network YouTube channel and find this along with other shows. They've got Knut Svanholm's Freedom Footprint show on there as well. We're doing all we can to help them with video content. They're doing all they can to translate as many Bitcoin books into as many different languages as possible. Excellent place to go and get a book and get 10% discount using that code BITTEN, and another 10% discount paying via the Lightning Network. I'll catch you on the next show, guys. Thank you so much for listening. Stack safe. See you later.